For generations, the echoing, exasperated refrain of a single phrase has resonated through the history of British television, defining an era of comedy and anchoring a legendary actor to a singular, monumental persona. Harry H. Corbett became a household name by delivering lines with a sharp, exaggerated intensity that captured the imagination of millions. Yet behind that unforgettable voice lay a complex tapestry of professional ambition and deep personal sacrifice. While the public roared with laughter at the weekly misfortunes of Harold Steptoe, quiet whispers began to circulate behind the scenes regarding the true nature of the man who brought this frustrated scrap dealer to life. Audiences frequently wondered whether the bitter resentment displayed on screen was merely an immaculate piece of acting or a reflection of a deeper, more turbulent internal reality that the actor could never truly escape. These persistent questions did not simply evaporate when the cameras stopped rolling, nor did they vanish in the decades following his untimely death. Instead, they grew progressively louder as the myth of the character began to completely overshadow the reality of the man. Now, after years of public speculation and sensationalized media interpretations, his daughter has stepped forward to dismantle the rumors and offer an authentic, intimate portrait of her father's complicated relationship with the role that simultaneously made him a global icon and trapped him in a creative cage. To truly understand the profound weight of Harry H. Corbett's legacy, one must examine the staggering, almost incomprehensible scale of success achieved by Steptoe and Son during its peak broadcasting years in the United Kingdom. This was not merely a popular sitcom that people watched to pass the time. It was a bona fide national phenomenon that completely paralyzed the country every single week, drawing in unprecedented audiences of over 28 million viewers. The cultural impact of the show was so immense and far-reaching that senior political figures and campaign managers genuinely worried that its broadcast schedule would actively prevent citizens from leaving their homes to vote in crucial general elections. Such astronomical reach inevitably created an incredibly fixed, immutable identity for Corbett, transforming him overnight from a versatile performer into a living embodiment of working-class frustration and generational despair. Every week, expectant audiences tuned in across the nation, eagerly waiting for the inevitable climax of familial tension where Corbett would lean forward, twist his expressive features, and deliver his iconic catchphrase with biting clarity. That single line, "You dirty old man," instantly evolved beyond a simple piece of scripted dialogue to become a permanent cultural imprint, a linguistic shorthand that defined his public existence and ensured that no matter what other creative endeavors he pursued, this specific version of him was the only one the public would ever truly hold on to. However, the very elements that made Harold Steptoe such a compelling, universally relatable figure were precisely the factors that created an inescapable professional prison for the exceptionally talented actor portraying him. Harold was a character defined by chronic entrapment, a deeply resentful son who was constantly reaching for a higher, more intellectual existence, only to be perpetually dragged back down into the literal and metaphorical mud by his manipulative father. Over the years, as the boundaries between television fiction and real-world reality began to blur for the general public, audiences naturally assumed that the profound bitterness and existential exhaustion displayed by Harold were genuine traits possessed by Corbett himself. This widespread assumption laid the foundation for a multitude of persistent rumors, with critics and viewers alike questioning whether the actor secretly harbored an intense hatred for the show that had effectively monopolized his career and limited his artistic growth. Unlike temporary tabloid gossip, these dark rumors did not fade with the passage of time. They followed him relentlessly through the latter stages of his career and continued to dominate discussions about his artistic legacy long after he had left the stage forever. What makes this narrative profoundly tragic and endlessly fascinating is the underlying truth behind the public's curiosity, as Corbett was never a traditional comedian seeking easy laughs, but a highly sophisticated, deeply serious dramatic actor who found himself utterly consumed by his own comedic creation. Long before he ever set foot on a television set or uttered a single line of comedic dialogue, Harry H. Corbett had spent years intensely studying the craft of acting, immersing himself in avant-garde movements that demanded absolute emotional realism and psychological depth. He was a dedicated practitioner of method acting, having honed his skills in experimental theater environments where performers were expected to completely deconstruct themselves to find the raw, unvarnished truth of a character. Consequently, when a single caricature-like television role suddenly became the definitive summation of his entire existence, it sparked an intense underlying creative tension that would quietly persist for the remainder of his professional life. On one hand, the massive success of the sitcom provided him with undeniable international recognition, long-term financial stability, and an undisputed, permanent place in the prestigious annals of television history. On the other hand, it drastically narrowed the industry's perception of his capabilities, causing risk-averse producers to hesitate when considering him for serious dramatic roles and leaving audiences completely unable to accept him as anyone other than the shouting scrap dealer from Shepherd's Bush. This constant struggle between the security of a beloved persona and the artistic starvation of a typecast dramatic actor formed the core conflict of his maturity, creating a poignant dichotomy between the wealthy celebrity the world adored and the frustrated artist who longed to break free. The public's total fixation on Harold Steptoe effectively erased the rich history of the man before the fame, blinding audiences to the fact that Corbett had lived an incredibly diverse, rigorous, and often perilous life before ever finding commercial success. His remarkable journey did not begin in the familiar, rain-slicked streets of working-class England, but in the distant, tropical climate of Rangoon, Burma, where he was born into the highly disciplined and strictly structured environment of a British military family. His father served with distinction as a colonial quartermaster sergeant, and for a very brief period during his infancy, it appeared as though young Harry's life would follow a thoroughly predictable, institutionalized path within the British Empire. However, any semblance of early childhood stability was completely shattered when he was merely 18 months old, as his mother tragically succumbed to a fatal bout of dysentery, leaving a devastating emotional void that he was far too young to intellectually comprehend. This profound loss fundamentally altered the trajectory of his destiny, resulting in the infant being hastily sent across the ocean to England, where he was taken in and raised by his maternal aunt in the industrial heartlands of Manchester. Growing up in a fiercely working-class neighborhood during an era of economic hardship, he was exposed early on to an environment where opportunities were scarce, survival was a daily calculation, and expectations for young men were explicitly modest. This challenging upbringing was certainly not the typical incubator for a future television icon, but rather the harsh, grounding reality of a young boy who quickly learned to navigate the world without the traditional emotional support systems that most children take completely for granted. Despite the socioeconomic hurdles placed in his path, Harry demonstrated a remarkably sharp intelligence and an innate academic potential during his early schooling, comfortably passing the highly competitive scholarship examinations required to attend a prestigious local grammar school. Unfortunately, the severe financial constraints weighing heavily upon his adoptive family rendered this academic advancement completely impossible, forcing him to decline the opportunity and instead attend a standard secondary modern school where educational resources were drastically limited. It was within the walls of this underfunded institution, however, that his unique survival mechanisms began to manifest as distinct personality traits, as he developed an incredibly sharp wit, a flawless sense of comedic timing, and a profound capacity for observing human behavior. These raw attributes were not yet refined acting skills, but they served as the vital, organic foundations for the hyper-observant style of performance that would eventually define his professional career, teaching him how to use humor as both a protective shield and a tool for social connection. The onset of the Second World War demanded that he abandon his youthful ambitions and enter the global conflict, enlisting directly into the elite ranks of the Royal Marines to serve his country during its darkest hour. This was explicitly not a comfortable, symbolic, or rearguard deployment. Corbett was sent directly into the brutal theater of the Pacific War, where he engaged in intense, chaotic, and traumatizing hand-to-hand combat against a fierce enemy. Surviving the absolute horrors of frontline warfare has a profound way of stripping an individual down to their absolute psychological core, and for Harry, these harrowing experiences left an indelible, lifelong mark upon his psyche. The war gifted him an incredibly deep, intimate understanding of human terror, existential dread, and raw behavioral reactions under extreme pressure, lessons that no prestigious acting conservatory or academic institution could ever hope to replicate. When he eventually returned to civilian life and pursued a career on the stage, these severe wartime experiences heavily influenced his artistic approach, infusing his performances with a rare level of grit, authenticity, and gravity that modern television audiences could palpably feel, even if they could never fully articulate why his acting felt so uniquely dangerous and real. Following his demobilization from the military, his professional path was anything but straightforward or certain, reflecting the restless, searching nature of a young veteran trying to find his place in a drastically altered post-war society. He spent a significant period wandering through Australia, testing his boundaries and exploring various avenues of employment before finally returning to England to embark on a highly practical training program to become a professional radiographer. While this medical field offered a stable, respectable, and financially secure future, the sterile environment of the hospital could not quiet the persistent, undeniable urge toward artistic performance that had begun to take root deep within his soul. The profound desire to step outside of his own identity, to inhabit the lives of others, and to communicate the immense complexities of the human condition through the ancient art of storytelling eventually became completely impossible to ignore. Making a courageous, highly risky leap of faith, he abandoned his stable medical prospects and fully committed himself to the precarious world of professional acting, entering a grueling period of theatrical apprenticeship that was entirely devoid of glamour, wealth, or public recognition. The definitive turning point of his formative acting career arrived when he successfully joined Joan Littlewood's legendary theatre workshop at the Theatre Royal, Stratford East, an institution that was aggressively redefining the landscape of British drama. This was not a traditional, polite theatrical environment focused on classical recitations. It was a highly demanding, radical, and politically charged collective that was deeply rooted in the revolutionary principles of Konstantin Stanislavski's system of acting. Here, surrounded by working-class creatives and intellectual radicals, Harry completely immersed himself in the intense discipline of method acting, learning how to tap into his own deep-seated childhood traumas and wartime memories to construct fiercely authentic characters. During this prolific decade, he was not chasing superficial fame, Hollywood stardom, or easy television payouts. He was meticulously building a formidable artistic craft, earning the deep respect of his peers as a serious, uncompromising dramatic actor of the highest caliber. To prevent the growing industry confusion between himself and another popular contemporary entertainer named Harry Corbett, he made the deliberate decision to insert the middle initial H into his professional billing, a small but significant alteration that marked the true birth of Harry H. Corbett as a distinct, highly respected force in British theatre. The fateful moment that would permanently alter the course of his life and career occurred with deceptive simplicity when he was cast in a new, experimental BBC television play written by the brilliant comedy writing duo Ray Galton and Alan Simpson. Originally conceived as a completely self-contained, one-off broadcast for an anthology series, the script introduced the world to Harold Steptoe, a complex man caught in an agonizing deadlock between personal ambition and filial obligation, intellectual vanity and structural entrapment. This was a role that demanded infinitely more than standard slapstick choices or superficial comedic line delivery. It required immense psychological depth, a capacity for tragic vulnerability, and a fierce, underlying anger that mirrored the frustrations of an entire generation of post-war working-class men. The creative chemistry between Harry H. Corbett and his brilliant co-star, Wilfrid Brambell, was instantaneous, electric, and terrifyingly real, elevating the written material into a profound piece of social realism disguised as a situation comedy. The executive management at the BBC immediately recognized the unprecedented cultural lightning they had caught in a bottle. The viewing public responded with overwhelming enthusiasm, and before the actors could fully comprehend the shift, a full television series was commissioned, setting into motion a cultural juggernaut that would simultaneously crown Corbett as a king of comedy and systematically dismantle his dreams of becoming a classical dramatic heavyweight. As the unprecedented success of Steptoe and Son systematically conquered the British media landscape, the immense, unrelenting weight of public expectation began to exert a severe, suffocating pressure on Harry H. Corbett's private existence. On the television screen, he was a master of absolute precision, controlling every twitch of his face and modulation of his voice, with the practiced ease of a highly trained method actor executing a flawless performance. Off-screen, however, his personal life was rapidly transforming into a chaotic, highly unpredictable environment, where the boundaries of his personal freedom were constantly shrinking under the intense glare of national celebrity. The more the show dominated the weekly ratings and cultural conversation, the less physical and psychological space there was for Harry to exist as an independent individual outside the towering shadow of Harold Steptoe. This profound internal and external tension inevitably began to reflect itself in his domestic life, fractures appearing in the relationships he had established long before the intoxicating potion of massive television fame had completely altered his reality. His first marriage to the highly talented actress Sheila Stiefel had been forged during his lean, intellectually stimulating years in the avant-garde theater, a relationship built on shared artistic struggles and bohemian ideals. However, as his career accelerated at a dizzying, uncontrollable pace, the unique strains of sudden, overwhelming stardom began to inflict a heavy, unsustainable toll on their matrimonial bond. Exhausting filming schedules, endless promotional tour, and the invasive nature of constant public recognition placed an unbearable pressure on the relationship, creating an emotional distance that eventually culminated in a painful divorce just as his career reached its absolute zenith. From the external perspective of the media and the adoring public, Corbett was the ultimate embodiment of modern show business success, a wealthy, universally recognized star sitting at the pinnacle of his profession. Privately, however, his entire emotional landscape was undergoing a massive, unsettling shift as he struggled to find a sense of true stability amidst the whirlwind of fame. He eventually found the profound grounding and emotional structure he desperately craved when he met and married Maureen Blott, a highly accomplished actress and dancer who understood the unique pressures of the entertainment industry. This second marriage brought a much-needed sense of domestic peace and personal sanctuary, providing him with a secure haven away from the demanding public eye. The union blessed him with two children, Susanna and Jonathan, and he embraced the role of fatherhood with an absolute, unadulterated enthusiasm that stood in stark contrast to the frustrated, childless bachelor he portrayed on television. He frequently and openly described his children as his absolute greatest achievement in life, prioritizing their well-being and happiness above any prestigious industry awards or box office milestones. This deeply tender, nurturing, and fiercely protective side of his personality was a reality that was completely hidden from the general public, who could only ever see him through the narrow lens of his famous character. Yet even within the warm embrace of this settled, loving family life, the crushing pressure of his monolithic television fame continued to intensify with each passing year. Being tied so inextricably to a single, hyper-recognizable role meant that every single creative project he attempted was subjected to immediate, often unfair comparisons to the majestic heights of Steptoe and Son*. Other cinematic and theatrical opportunities became heartbreakingly limited, as industry executives and the general viewing public struggled mightily to see him as anything other than the exasperated herald. Over time, this relentless professional confinement began to manifest as a heavy, exhausting psychological weight that proved incredibly difficult to escape or mitigate. Typecasting was no longer just an annoying career hurdle or a topic for agent negotiations. It had evolved into a deeply personal, existential crisis that struck at the very core of his identity as a trained dramatic artist. No matter how much dedication he poured into different theatrical productions, and regardless of his brilliant prior work with Joan Littlewood, he was repeatedly, magnetically pulled back into the exact same comedic identity by the public demand. This endless, exhausting cycle of repetition slowly and methodically wore down his naturally resilient spirit, leaving him feeling creatively starved and personally unfulfilled despite his immense wealth. To cope with the escalating levels of stress and the profound frustration of his artistic confinement, he began to rely more heavily on the temporary numbing effects of alcohol. While heavy drinking was admittedly a pervasive, culturally accepted norm within the British entertainment industry during that era, for Corbett, it unfortunately transformed into a primary coping mechanism to manage the crushing anxieties of his career. The punishing combination of long, grueling studio schedules, intense public expectations, and the internal bitterness of being unable to move beyond a single character created a destructive cycle that was exceptionally difficult to break. Simultaneously, the immense physical demands of his highly energetic, physically expressive style of acting began to take a severe, noticeable toll on his aging body. Years of throwing himself into the intense, physically demanding arguments required by the scripts resulted in chronic back problems and a variety of other debilitating health issues that he quietly endured behind closed doors. These physical ailments were never widely publicized or discussed in the entertainment columns of the day, but they formed a painful, exhausting part of his everyday reality, as he struggled to maintain the high-octane energy demanded by his public persona. The ultimate, undeniable turning point in this mounting health crisis arrived when he suffered a massive, life-threatening heart attack that sent shockwaves through his family. This frightening medical emergency was not a sudden, random anomaly, but the direct, inevitable consequence of years of immense professional strain, heavy smoking, and the frantic lifestyle habits of a superstar. The heart attack acted as a stark, uncompromising wake-up call, forcing him to directly confront the unsustainable breakneck pace at which he had been living and working for over a decade. In the immediate aftermath of his hospitalization, he made significant conscious changes to his daily existence, drastically cutting back on his alcohol consumption, managing his stress levels with immense care, and becoming far more selective with the professional projects he accepted. Yet despite these admirable efforts to reform his lifestyle, the profound physiological and psychological effects of those intense, high-pressure years remained deeply embedded within his system. Remarkably, despite the severe warnings from his medical team, his profound passion for the acting profession prevented him from stepping away from the spotlight completely. He continued to work consistently in television dramas and on the theatrical stage, fiercely determined to prove to himself and the industry that his talent extended far beyond the confines of a single sitcom. While none of these later roles ever managed to replicate or match the astronomical commercial success of Steptoe and Son Asterisk, they represented something infinitely more important to Corbett: a brave, continuous effort to redefine his artistic identity and reclaim ownership of his name before the final curtain fell. In the quieter, more reflective final years of his life, his long-held perspective on his monumental career began to undergo a noticeable, gentle shift. The intense, burning frustration that had once characterized his thoughts on typecasting slowly began to soften, replaced by a profound, mature appreciation for exactly what the show had achieved on a cultural level. He began to look past his own personal artistic restrictions and instead recognized the immense, unadulterated joy and comfort the series had brought to millions of ordinary families across the globe. Away from the frantic energy of television studios and the constant, demanding scrutiny of public attention, he consciously chose to ground himself completely in the love of the people closest to him. These tranquil, domestic years revealed a drastically different side of the legendary performer, one that was entirely unconcerned with public perception, box office numbers, or industry validation, and deeply rooted in the simple, quiet joys of being a devoted husband and father. Part 2. The true measure of a legendary entertainer's impact is often found in the longevity of the myths that rise like a thick fog around their memory once they are no longer here to defend themselves. For decades after Harry H. Corbett passed away, the speculative stories, wild rumors, and sensationalized accounts regarding his private life did not gently fade into the background of television history. Instead, they grew exponentially louder and more distorted. In the distinct absence of a strong, definitive voice speaking directly from within his immediate family, biographical assumptions and creative fabrications naturally rushed to fill the historical gaps. Certain media analysts and unauthorized biographers consistently painted a bleak portrait of a deeply bitter man who utterly loathed the character that gave him financial security, while others claimed with absolute certainty that his relationship with his iconic co-star had degenerated into a state of toxic, unmitigated hatred. Over a significant period of time, these dramatic, highly negative narratives were repeated so frequently across various media platforms that they gradually solidified in the collective public consciousness, beginning to feel like undisputed historical facts rather than unverified tabloid gossip. It was precisely this alarming, systematic distortion of her father's true character and lived experience that ultimately compelled his daughter, Susanna Corbett, to courageously step into the public arena to reclaim his narrative. Her profound motivation for doing so was deeply personal, born out of a painful, protracted observation of her father's public image slowly transforming into an unrecognizable caricature that completely ignored the immense warmth and complexity of his actual life. She watched with growing distress as a brilliant, multifaceted man who had survived combat in the Pacific and mastered avant-garde theater was systematically reduced to a series of simplified, tragic narratives designed to sell magazines and boost television ratings. One of the most persistent, deeply entrenched rumors that had circulated for years focused heavily on the supposedly venomous relationship between Corbett and his older co-star, Wilfrid Brambell. Because their on-screen arguments as father and son felt so breathtakingly real, visceral, and emotionally charged, the viewing public naturally assumed that this friction must be a direct reflection of a genuine, deeply rooted hostility existing between the two men when the cameras stopped filming. Susanna addressed this specific salacious rumor with absolute directness and clarity, explicitly dismantling the sensationalized myth of a lifelong backstage feud. She explained that while they were undeniably very different human beings with contrasting personalities who occasionally grew irritated with one another after years of working in close proximity, there was absolutely no deep-seated malice or toxic hatred between them. They were fundamentally not a traditional, inseparable comedy double act built upon a foundation of shared social lives and synchronized off-screen friendships, but rather two intensely professional, deeply serious dramatic actors who showed up to perform a job with absolute dedication and then returned to their respective private lives. To completely shatter the validity of the feud rumor, she pointed directly to a historical fact that completely contradicts the narrative of mutual loathing. After the television series had officially concluded its historic run, the two actors actively chose to embark on extensive, grueling international theater tour together. It requires an immense amount of basic professional respect and personal tolerance to willingly spend months traveling, living, and performing alongside another person across the globe. An itinerary that would be utterly impossible to execute if they genuinely could not stand the sight of each other. The reality of their professional partnership, as described by the person who actually witnessed its aftermath, was far less dramatic, far more dignified, and infinitely more human than the polarized versions that had been circulated by gossip columnists for decades. Another equally pervasive rumor centered around Corbett's supposed overarching resentment toward Steptoe and Son itself, with critics claiming he viewed the show as a curse that ruined his artistic potential. Susanna provided a beautifully balanced, nuanced perspective on this complex issue, acknowledging that while her father undeniably experienced moments of profound professional frustration due to the severe limitations of industry typecasting, this was never the same as harboring a deep, bitter regret for taking the role. He possessed a sharp, mature intelligence that allowed him to fully understand and respect exactly what the historic show had gifted him: unprecedented global recognition, total financial stability for his loved ones, and a permanent safe legacy within the cultural fabric of modern society. In his mature years, he openly and warmly appreciated these immense blessings, even while maintaining a clear-eyed, realistic understanding of the professional sacrifices that had accompanied them. The profound need to publicly correct these widespread misconceptions became drastically more urgent for the family after a highly publicized BBC television dramatization presented a version of his life that they felt was deeply misleading, sensationalized, and fundamentally inaccurate. This controversial broadcast heavily emphasized backstage conflict, psychological torment, and unmitigated emotional strain, creating highly compelling, dramatic television for modern viewers but completely failing to provide an honest, accurate, or complete picture of the man. In direct response to this media distortion, Susanna began sharing intimate, beautiful details that only someone who had grown up under his roof could possibly provide, painting a picture of a household filled with laughter, intellectual curiosity, and profound parental devotion. She spoke eloquently about his sharp, playful humor at home, his deeply tender and encouraging interactions with his children, and the small, ordinary, everyday moments that revealed his true essence far away from the bright studio lights. Furthermore, she directly addressed the more salacious personal rumors regarding his supposedly wild, unstable lifestyle during the height of his fame in the swinging 60s. She did not attempt to dishonestly deny that he thoroughly enjoyed the massive attention, validation, and social perks that naturally accompanied global fame during his early bachelor years. However, she emphasized with immense passion that once he met his wife Maureen, settled down into domestic life, and welcomed his children into the world, his personal priorities underwent a massive, permanent transformation. He made a conscious, continuous effort to be an intensely present, loving father, frequently breaking the traditional boundaries of show business by bringing his young children along on extended theatrical tours so the family could remain unified. What her beautifully written and deeply researched account ultimately offers the world is not a desperate, complete reversal of his life story, but a much-needed, profoundly moving human correction. The reality of Harry H. Corbett was infinitely more balanced, gentle, and complex than the extreme, tragic narratives that had grown like weeds around his grave for a generation. In the final, poignant chapter of his life, the relentless, frantic pace that had characterized his early career gradually began to slow down, giving way to a much quieter, more contemplative existence. He was still a dedicated working actor, continuing to accept challenging roles on the theatrical stage and in television dramas, but there was a distinct, undeniable shift in his overarching focus and energy. His failing health explicitly dictated this change of pace, as the long-term physiological damages wrought by years of intense career stress, sleep deprivation, and heavy smoking could no longer be ignored or pushed aside by sheer willpower. Following his recovery from the initial severe heart attack, he became acutely, quietly aware of his physical limitations, realizing that his body was finally demanding the rest he had denied it for decades. He understood with absolute clarity that time was no longer an infinite commodity that he could take for granted, and this profound realization infused his remaining years with a beautiful sense of intention and peace. Remarkably, he refused to allow his physical vulnerabilities to force him into a state of bitter, reclusive retirement or total withdrawal from the creative world he loved so dearly. He continued to act, but he did so with an immense amount of care, deliberately choosing specific roles that offered less physical pressure, shorter shooting schedules, and a deeper sense of artistic purpose. There was no longer a frantic, burning need within him to prove his worth to cynical industry executives or to desperately outrun the shadow of Harold Steptoe. Instead, there was a quiet, dignified acceptance of everything he had already accomplished. Within the sanctuary of his home, this profound shift toward tranquility was even more beautifully evident to his family, who cherished the increased presence of a man who had once been perpetually claimed by the public. He dedicated his remaining physical energy to creating lasting memories with his wife, Maureen, and his beloved children, Susanna and Jonathan, deeply valuing the ordinary domestic moments that had once been completely overshadowed by the demands of international stardom. According to his daughter's moving recollections, he took an immense, quiet pride in the daily growth and happiness of his family, displaying a deep, unvarnished warmth that stood in beautiful contrast to the cynical, shouting persona the world saw on television. Even as his physical health continued to slowly decline behind the scenes, his trademark wit, sharp intellect, and playful humor never wavered for a single moment. He remained incredibly gracious and responsive to his legions of dedicated fans, effortlessly transforming simple, brief encounters on the street into lighthearted, memorable exchanges that left people beaming with joy. At home, he stayed thoroughly playful, often seamlessly blending his natural instincts as a brilliant performer into the everyday fabric of family life to make his children laugh. He was also deeply, maturely aware of how he would ultimately be remembered by history, accepting the reality that the character of Harold Steptoe would always be the definitive anchor of his public legacy. Instead of continuing to waste precious emotional energy resisting this inevitability, he consciously chose to look back on the character with a profound sense of gratitude for the joy it brought. His sudden passing occurred when his daughter Susanna was still a young girl, lending a particularly heartbreaking, poignant weight to the final, ordinary interaction they shared together on Earth. In a moments-long, thoroughly mundane domestic exchange that would later carry a lifetime of emotional significance, he simply asked her to bring him a pair of shoes, and in her youthful haste she accidentally brought the wrong ones. It was a completely ordinary, simple family moment that no one could have guessed would be their final connection before the unpredictable hand of fate intervened. Shortly thereafter, while she was away on a routine school trip that he had enthusiastically encouraged her to attend, he suffered a final, fatal heart attack and peacefully passed away in the hospital. There was absolutely no grand, theatrical spectacle or media circus surrounding his passing, but the immediate impact of his loss was felt deeply across the entire nation he had entertained for decades. For years afterward, devoted fans continued to make quiet pilgrimages to his final resting place, leaving behind small tokens and deeply moving personal notes, a beautiful, silent testament to the enduring power of his work. His profound legacy is explicitly not defined by a single, frustrating piece of typecasting, but rather by the extraordinary manner in which his performance has triumphantly endured across shifting generations. New audiences who were not even alive during the peak of British television continue to discover Steptoe and Son asterisk, responding with the exact same laughter, tears, and deep emotional connection that original viewers felt decades ago. Through his daughter's tireless, loving efforts to clarify his true life story, that magnificent legacy has finally become complete, not dishonestly rewritten to erase the struggles, but understood with an infinitely greater depth of human compassion. Harry H. Corbett gave the world a masterpiece of comedic acting that will never be forgotten, but his actual journey through life proved to be far more complicated, courageous, and beautiful than anyone ever realized. Part 3. The true architecture of an iconic television performance is rarely built on simple laughter alone. Rather, it requires a profound underlying bedrock of human truth that resonates across the barriers of time and social class. When Harry H. Corbett first stepped into the shoes of Harold Steptoe, he brought with him a lifetime of unseen baggage, from the tragic loss of his mother in colonial Burma to the horrific realities of frontline combat in the Royal Marines. It was this precise reservoir of lived experience that allowed him to transform a basic sitcom script into a sweeping, devastatingly accurate portrait of post-war British frustration. While the average viewer tuned in solely to be entertained by the high-velocity verbal sparring matches between a father and son, they were subconsciously responding to a deeper, universal tragedy of a man trapped by circumstance, duty, and economic stagnation. Corbett did not merely memorize lines and execute cues. He inhabited the very soul of Harold, utilizing the rigorous principles of the Stanislavski method to ensure that every scream of anger and sigh of resignation felt entirely justified and heartbreakingly authentic. This absolute commitment to the truth of the character was precisely what elevated the show to an unprecedented national phenomenon, capturing the hearts of over 28 million weekly viewers and cementing his place in the cultural history of the nation. Yet the absolute perfection of this performance became the very mechanism that sought to systematically erase the memory of the versatile, highly accomplished dramatic actor who had created it. For the vast majority of the public, Harry H. Corbett as an independent entity ceased to exist the moment Steptoe and Son became a permanent fixture of the British broadcasting landscape. The industry itself, notoriously lacking in imagination when dealing with massive commercial success, immediately closed its doors to his broader artistic aspirations, refusing to see past the dirty flat cap and the exaggerated Cockney accent of his famous persona. This professional isolation was an incredibly bitter pill to swallow for a man who had spent a brilliant decade working alongside Joan Littlewood at the theatre workshop, striving to create a revolutionary, socially conscious form of British theatre. The constant, exhausting struggle to remind the world that he was a highly trained artist capable of performing classical drama formed the defining conflict of his professional maturity, creating a profound dichotomy between his public success and his private artistic starvation. Despite this immense frustration, he never allowed his standards of professionalism to slip, approaching every single repetition of the famous character with the same absolute dedication, precision, and respect that he would have granted a masterpiece by Shakespeare or Ibsen. Behind the closed doors of his private life, away from the demanding glare of television cameras and the constant intrusion of adoring fans, Corbett fought a quiet, continuous battle to protect his own humanity from being entirely consumed by his public identity. The immense pressure of being a national icon, combined with the profound frustration of professional typecasting, inevitably began to exert an exhausting toll on his mental and physical well-being. To navigate the severe anxieties of an industry that refused to allow him to evolve, he frequently turned to the temporary solace of alcohol, a destructive habit that was heavily reinforced by the hard drinking culture of the mid-century entertainment world. This reliance on alcohol, coupled with a relentless work schedule and an inveterate smoking habit, slowly and systematically eroded his physical health, laying the foundation for the severe cardiovascular issues that would eventually cut his life tragically short. Yet even in the midst of these intense personal struggles, he found a profound, transformative salvation in the love of his second wife, Maureen, and the birth of his two children, Susanna and Jonathan. His family became his absolute sanctuary, a vital space where he was explicitly not Harold Steptoe, the frustrated scrap dealer, but Harry, a deeply loving, intensely present, and fiercely protective father who valued the happiness of his children above all else. The persistent rumors that arose after his untimely death, painting him as a deeply bitter, isolated man who spent his final years harboring an intense hatred for his career and his co-star, were a source of profound pain for the family he left behind. These simplified, highly dramatic narratives completely ignored the beautiful, nuanced reality of his later years, during which his early professional bitterness softened into a mature, deeply philosophical appreciation for the immense joy his work had brought to millions. His daughter, Susanna Corbett, eventually recognized that the public memory of her father was being systematically distorted by sensationalized media portrayals and lazy biographical assumptions that prioritized conflict over truth. Stepping forward with immense courage and deep love, she utilized her unique perspective as his child to completely dismantle the false myths of the backstage feuds and the unmitigated professional regret. She revealed a man who was deeply grateful for the financial security and lasting legacy the show had granted his loved ones, a professional who respected his co-star Wilfrid Brambell deeply despite their obvious personality differences, and a human being who remained intensely playful, intellectual, and humorous until his very last breath. Ultimately, the magnificent legacy of Harry H. Corbett is one of absolute artistic triumph over the crushing limitations of commercial success, a testament to the enduring power of a performance rooted in absolute human truth. He managed to take a character designed for temporary television entertainment and turn it into an immortal, universally recognized symbol of human struggle that continues to captivate and move new generations of viewers decades after his passing. Through the beautiful, clear-eyed testimony of his daughter, the world has finally been granted a complete, unvarnished look at the real man behind the iconic voice. A man who faced immense childhood tragedy, survived the horrors of war, mastered the highest levels of dramatic craft, and ultimately found his greatest fulfillment not in the applause of millions, but in the quiet love of his family. Now that the thick fog of sensationalized rumors has finally been cleared away by the truth, we can look back at Harry H. Corbett with a profound, renewed sense of admiration, recognizing him not as a tragic victim of his own success, but as one of the finest, most courageous, and genuinely human actors to ever grace our screens. The enduring brilliance of his work lies in its remarkable capacity to completely transcend the specific cultural and historical era in which it was originally created, remaining vibrantly alive and relevant to this day. When modern audiences watch Harold Steptoe desperately plotting his escape from his suffocating domestic life, they are not merely watching an old British sitcom from the 20th century. They are witnessing a timeless, profoundly moving exploration of familial duty, shattered dreams, and existential entrapment. This universal relevance is the direct result of Corbett's refusal to treat the role as simple caricature, choosing instead to infuse it with the raw emotional stakes of a high-stakes dramatic tragedy. By doing so, he ensured that his performance would outlive the specific social landscape of post-war Britain, continuing to strike a powerful, deeply resonant chord with anyone who has ever felt stuck in a life they desperately wish to change. Furthermore, the incredible journey of his life serves as a powerful, inspiring reminder of the profound resilience of the human spirit when faced with immense adversity and structural hurdles. From the absolute isolation of losing his mother in a distant land, to the severe economic hardships of his working-class upbringing in industrial Manchester, Harry H. Corbett consistently demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adapt, survive, and thrive. He did not allow the lack of financial resources or the denial of a grammar school education to dim his sharp intellect or suppress his natural creative instincts. Instead, he used his challenging environment as a rich, invaluable training ground for his future artistic endeavors. His courageous service in the Royal Marines during the brutal Pacific Campaign further forged his indomitable character, gifting him a profound perspective on life and death that kept him thoroughly grounded even when he reached the dizzying, intoxicating heights of international superstar status. It is also vital to recognize the immense, quiet courage displayed by his daughter Susanna in her decades-long quest to restore balance, dignity, and historical accuracy to her father's heavily distorted public narrative. It is an incredibly daunting, emotionally exhausting task to challenge the entrenched myths of the media landscape, especially when those myths have been repeated so frequently that they have achieved the status of cultural folklore. By sharing her intimate family memories, personal photographs, and private letters, she did not attempt to elevate her father into an flawless, unrealistic saint, but rather to reclaim his right to be remembered as a beautifully complex, multifaceted human being. Her moving biographical work stands as a magnificent act of filial devotion, ensuring that future generations of television historians and comedy fans will understand the true depth of the sacrifices that went into creating one of Britain's greatest cultural treasures. In the final analysis, Harry H. Corbett's life story should not be viewed through a lens of pity or artistic tragedy, but rather celebrated as a monumental victory of creative excellence and personal integrity. He successfully navigated the treacherous, often soul-destroying waters of massive commercial celebrity without ever losing his core decency, his profound love for his family, or his deep respect for the ordinary people who comprised his audience. He left behind a body of work that continues to defeat the passing of time, a family that remembers him with an absolute, unadulterated love, and a cultural legacy that remains completely unmatched in the history of modern entertainment. As the years continue to advance and the landscape of television undergoes massive transformations, the sharp, expressive features and unforgettable voice of Harry H. Corbett will endure, a timeless monument to an extraordinary actor who gave everything he had to the craft of making the world both laugh and feel.